Well, hello everybody, and thanks to everybody joining online for our webinar today, which is titled Australia's National 24-Hour Movement Guidelines for Adults. What's happened, what's changed, what's next? And this is the first of a number of webinars that we'll hold on this topic. I'll introduce myself. My name is David Dunstan. I'm a professor within the Institute for Physical Activity and Nutrition at Deakin University and also Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute here in Melbourne. I'm also the president of the Asia Pacific Society for Physical Activity, and we are presenting this webinar on behalf of ASPA today, and we're really thank everybody for registering to participate in the event, and we look forward to the interaction that will follow from our presentations today. We really want to make this interactive as possible. But of course, I'm currently standing here at Deakin University, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies and waterways on which our students, staff and communities come together. And as we learn and teach through virtually and physically constructed places over time, we pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of the Wadawurrung country, Eastern Maar country and the Wurundjeri country, where all of our Deakin campuses are located. And of course, we acknowledge the many First Nations from where students join us online and make vital contributions to our learning communities. And of course, we acknowledge all the lands in which we're coming from today. It's quite diverse. So again, thank you for joining our seminar. We have two presentations followed by a question and answer session. And I'll introduce both the presenters as we get to their presentation. I just want to acknowledge that we are recording today's session, and we'll make this freely available for those that want to access this after the webinar. Courtney, if I could just get you to share our slide. I just want to take a moment to explain for those that aren't familiar with the Asia Pacific Society for Physical Activity, that this is a new society that was commenced in about 2020, which is a society to bring together academics, policymakers, health professionals and consumers who are passionate about progressing physical activity across the Asia Pacific, and really wanted to provide a forum like today for researchers, practitioners and policymakers to really network and share and hear the latest physical activity research, which you'll hear today about the 24-hour movement guidelines. And obviously we want to build capacity in physical activity across that region and advance physical activity research, knowledge and dissemination. And importantly, and today's seminar has really been the inspiration of our advocacy committee, is advocate to ensure physical activity is incorporated into health. So next slide. Just by way of introduction, ASPA is run by volunteers, but we have quite a lively group of people involved in 6 special interest groups, which you can see there. And we have 8 committees, including an executive committee, and recognising the various participants in physical activity research and practice across the Asia Pacific region. Okay, and I'll now want to introduce our first presenter today, Dr. Monique Francois. Is an exercise physiologist and a researcher at the University of Wollongong, and was awarded a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of British Columbia in Canada. in 2017 and has invested a lot of time in working on the 24-hour movement guidelines. So we're very fortunate to have Monique involved in our webinar. And primarily, her research focuses on examining physical activity for health and well-being within randomised controlled trials and intervention studies. And currently has co-led, and I'll lead into this, the update of the National Physical Activity Guidelines, and in 2026 she's leading the development and coordination of the consumer-facing resources and materials to support the first phase of public messaging and implementation of the 24-hour movement guidelines. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Monique, who's going to present. What we will do is we'll have question and answers that will follow each presenter, where you can use the Q&A that you can see at the bottom of the screen, or if you can put your hand up and I will try and unmute the microphone and we can directly ask Monique questions before we move on to the next presenter. So what I'll do now is hand over to you, Monique, for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you, ASPA, for inviting me to talk to these guidelines today. So today I'll be presenting on the 2026 24-hour movement guidelines for adults and older adults. What I've been asked to speak about is what's happened, so talking about the development of these new guidelines, where to access them, how we develop them, what's changed, so how do these guidelines differ from the previous Australian Physical Activity and Sedentary Behaviour guidelines, and then a little bit about what I know what's coming up and what we're working on this year to promote the guidelines. So back in 2023, so Tony Oakley and myself were commissioned to develop the 24-hour movement guidelines for adults and older adults. Thinking about the first half of the contract, so starting in June 2023, we put together a leadership group and started reviewing the evidence and existing guidelines. So this took place for sort of the first 6 to 8 months of the guideline development process. So in terms of the leadership, I'm fortunate for this group of amazing, dedicated people who dedicated the best part of 2 years to developing these guidelines. So we had representatives and experts in physical activity, sedentary behaviour and sleep. We had experts in the compositional analysis for the integrated component. We also formed a stakeholder engagement committee to oversee stakeholder activities and communication and dissemination, so we could start planning for the future. We had the lead of the Canadian 24-hour guidelines. So Canada was the first to release guidelines for adults in 2020. We had a methodologist who put in a huge amount of work supporting the evidence base for these guidelines, and also experts in disability and chronic conditions, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and the federal government were also involved throughout the process. So we weren't starting from scratch. So we were fortunate enough to have Tony Oakley, who was the lead for developing the 24-hour guidelines for the early years, children and young people. So these guidelines for, I guess, the first 17 years of life were first developed in Australia as 24-hour movement guidelines. As I said, we had the guidelines to work on from Canada. So Canada released guidelines for adults and older adults in 2020. We also had the large evidence base for adults, people with disability, people with chronic conditions to work on from the US and from the World Health Organization. And people who are part of our group were also involved in developing these guidelines. We had the expertise from there as well. So from these existing guidelines, we were able to use the grade a development process to help us develop these guidelines and update the guidelines from the existing evidence base that we had. So what it looked like at the start, so those first sort of 8 months that I was talking about, was a lot of systematic reviews and evidence searching and grading of the evidence. We quickly established that Canada had provided the most recent and high quality evidence base to update the guidelines. So the reviews that were done for Canada were updated for the recommendations for sensory behaviour, sleep and integrated. However, when Canada updated their guidelines, it was very close to the work that was done by the US and WHO. And so they didn't need to update that evidence base. So for physical activity, and because we added other domains for our recommendations for physical activity, we updated the reviews from WHO. De novo here just means we did have to start from scratch for some reviews and some populations and some outcomes that we wanted to be a part of these Australian physical activity guidelines. And so this included separate searches that were carried out to identify, reviews and intervention studies, specifically in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And further details on all of these reviews and sort of the process and research plan is available in the technical report. So these guidelines were developed based on the best available evidence at the time and process. So I'm not going to go into great detail about this at all, but the comprehensive literature searches and updates were done. Evidence was screened and selected using criteria already established. The grade framework was used, and this was heavily helped by our methodologist. Evidence quality, assessed and graded the recommendations. We then used a grade of development. So this was taking the existing recommendations from WHO, Canada, and kind of using the new evidence that we had to decide if the recommendations strength and certainty needed to change, and also considering the Australian context and feedback that we received from the consensus meeting and also the online surveys. So the consensus meeting was a big meeting that took place in Wollongong in April 2024. And this is where we drafted the recommendations, presented the evidence reviews. And then after that, we started to kind of finalize the recommendations. So April 2024, we held the consensus meeting. So this is where we drafted the recommendations. And then for the next 6 months after that, stakeholder consultation took place on these draft recommendations. Then the recommendations were refined and revised before the Australian government, accepted the guidelines in June 2025. So as we'll see in a little bit, these guidelines represent, a significant update to existing recommendations. So they're taking an integrated approach that considers like physical activity, sensory behaviour and sleep across the 24-hour period. Where to access them. So if you have not seen already, the technical report is the best point of call at the moment for these guidelines. And so this just gives you the link to the technical report. So at the moment, this document is got all of the evidence reviews and the final recommendations and guidelines for adults, older adults, adults and older adults with disability, and adults and older adults with chronic conditions. And this technical report is intended for use by policymakers, health professionals, and researchers. So the next question is, what has changed sort of in the last decade or so since the 2012 Australian Physical Activity and Sedentary Behaviour Guidelines? So the new movement guidelines encourage a more flexible and inclusive view of physical activity, with more of an emphasis on balancing all the different types of movement and activity across the day. So we consider physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep as interconnected behaviors. So changes in one then influence the other. And we're really looking to provide more of a balanced movement plan across the day. So we give evidence-based recommendations for each behavior. And then there's also the integrated recommendation, which I've just placed at the bottom here. What has also changed is we give evidence-based recommendations for not only adults and older adults, but also adults and older adults with disability and adults and older adults with chronic conditions. So the aim is to provide a more inclusive, person-centered recommendations that are flexible. As you'll see on the second page of the guidelines, we provide key companion statements. So sort of the how-to, and they differ for each, they're specific to each population. It's important as we consider these, and especially as I go through all of them that you see for physical activity, is that these recommendations are not intended to be rigidly applied to each day. Instead, like incremental shifts in terms of doing more physical activity, moving often and sleeping well, they start to shift the needle to improved overall health. So here I have highlighted I guess some of the main changes in physical activity. So moderate to vigorous physical activity together for 30 minutes or more on most days. So this is for adults and older adults. Muscle strengthening remains the same. Still emphasizes very important for overall health. We now include functional activities that target mobility, balance, and coordination, with a recommendation for adults and older adults on 3 or more days per week. And we also highlight and emphasize several hours and represent light intensity physical activity per day. So it's important to note that some of these physical activities can count towards multiple recommendations. So for example, walking up and down stairs contributes to both the MVPA and functional activity recommendations. And that's just one of the examples of, being flexible and meeting these guidelines or recommendations. Another new thing, which many of you know, is that we also have an evidence-based statement on steps. So it's in the companion statements for those who are able and track daily steps to aim for 7,000 or more steps per day. So I just acknowledging that I know that it's a lot. And so then the next steps become vital and important in how we communicate these guidelines. What a change in sedentary behavior recommendations. So we have 2 separate defined recommendations for limiting the amount of time we spend sedentary and to break up prolonged periods of sedentary behavior as often as possible. And for the first time in Australia, we have the inclusion of sleep recommendations. So 7 to 9 hours of good quality sleep for adults, 7 to 8 hours for older adults, with consistent bed and wake up times. And then you'll see in the guidelines the companion or how-to steps, which give a little bit more detail on those sleep recommendations as well. So the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander evidence search, and these are still to come, and they'll be based on further consultation and guidance from the community. I'm going to skip through this slide. So I guess what everyone is interested is what's coming up in 2026. So stage 1 is the public focus. So at the moment, we're developing co-designed public-facing promotion materials. So we're developing brochures, fact sheets, and FAQs with the public. There will be separate brochures for adults, older adults, adults and older adults living with disability, adults and older adults living with chronic condition, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so they'll all be separate brochures. And we will also have some translated materials coming. We're also developing an evaluation plan so we can move forward with the next steps to implement and communicate these guidelines. So in summary, these are the new guidelines for physical activity, sensory behaviour and sleep, so collectively known as the 24-hour movement guidelines, so interconnected. So we now have 24-hour movement guidelines for the early years children and young people, adults and older adults in Australia. So these have been developed based on the best available evidence, and what we have on the government website at the moment is the technical report. So this is just the first step of many. It's our task together to help engage Australians and promote them. So we want to message them in a way that is clear, relatable, and actionable. And these next steps will really be very important in terms of the promotion of these guidelines. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the next steps.
Well, thanks so much, Monique. And I have seen in the chat that the link to the technical report has been provided by Kristen. So please access that as you can see there. And I have seen a couple of questions coming in, which I will ask live if that's okay. And I think it's a burning question is, when do you expect the stage 1 to be released in terms of the public resources?
So we're expecting them to be released a little after mid this year.
Okay. And on that note, well, what we're expecting from ASPA is that there will be a subsequent webinar post the release there, so we can talk more about those public resources within a webinar. We have another question, and it was about your evaluation framework. Can you tell us more about the evaluation framework, what this will be evaluating, and how and when this will be undertaken?
Yeah, so the first stage of the evaluation framework is we're going to run a survey, a public survey on awareness of the current guidelines, and then a year later, if it changes with what we develop and we're able to do. So that's really the first stage. We will also be tracking downloads from the website and things like that. So the evaluation plan at the moment is basically just for this first phase. And then it will, once we get through this first phase, the evaluation plan will hopefully take into account the broader aspects of stakeholder participation and things like that.
Okay, I have a hand up from Ruth, which I'll allow her to ask a question to you, and then I'll come back to some of the questions in the Q&A. So you can now ask your question, Ruth.
Sorry, David, I didn't have a question. I was trying to cover the react button.
That's okay. That's all good. So I'll shift to the Q&A questions. Will there be a website for the general public?
This is, yeah, it's a question for the federal government. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Yep, that's okay. And then Laura had a question. Will there be more information coming out in relation to the sort of activity that is defined under each definition? So for example, moderate, vigorous intensity activity, sedentary behaviour, etc.
Yeah, what we've experienced so far in the public consultation is people want more examples, more images and more examples. So yes, yeah, we will be working on those.
We have a little bit more time for questions. If you want to either raise your hand or ask in the Q&A. I have another one here, Monique. Can you share if you already have any ideas or early strategies on how to communicate these guidelines to the public without them sounding too overwhelming to achieve? Yeah.
I don't at the moment. We have a big workshop next week, and I'm hoping that we can start to it's unclear at the moment.
Okay. The next question is getting a little bit into more of the detail about sedentary behaviour. Does it mention the specific time periods? For instance, how many minutes people should break up their sedentary behaviour?
No. And David probably knows this very well. There was not enough evidence to provide specific thresholds for sedentary behaviour in terms of, how long, how often, how much. So just as often as possible.
I think it's a useful prompt to say that we need more research in this space. A couple of other questions as they're coming in. I'm just looking. Can you please elaborate more about the research with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Or the consultation process, I think, is probably where that was from.
Yeah, so the first part of the development of the guidelines was based on existing literature. And then when the guidelines were drafted, we held some online focus groups about just to get early indications on the understanding of the guidelines and what it might mean to them. And then this next phase will be the most important and vital phase. So in May, we're going to go out to community, so start to do in-person consultation on what the guidelines might look like to them and how they would like them to be in order to develop the brochure, fact sheet, and FAQs at the moment. So that's what it's looking like at the moment.
Got time for a couple more questions, and there's one here from Alison. There are a lot of technical terms within the report. Is there a plan for delivering the public-facing messaging using plain English? And I think that you did answer this with the consumer materials, but do you want to elaborate on what they're likely to be?
Yes, this I think that's the most important thing is plain, simple, less wordy language. I can't say exactly what that would be at the moment, but that is the most important aspect of communicating these guidelines. They're very technical and a lot.
Yep. Just have a minute or so. So just looking here, a suggestion of having more examples of a few activities that would be specific to a population like midlife women supporting bone health. Just something to maybe consider. Will there be any merchandise to extend the awareness of the messaging? I don't know whether you can answer that. That's outside your remit.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. And I won't be able to get through all of these in the interest of time. Just looking, so one person has mentioned, for from the perspective of the general public, people may be only aware of the existence of such guidelines, and checking their contents in detail may require a relatively high level of health consciousness. Therefore, I believe it is necessary from a health communication standpoint to consider identifying the most important piece in each section and conveying it in either a single sentence. So keeping the language simple is probably the recommendation there. And I think you and your team are starting to look at that now, or the department is starting to look at that with the consumer materials. Yep. Monique, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but Monique, maybe if you could look at the questions, and if there's any that you can answer online, that would be great. But on behalf of ASPA, we really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you so much for your contributions over the multiple years to the development of these guidelines to you and the rest of the team. We're going to now shift to our second presentation, and it's more focused on the practical application of the new guidelines. And I wanted to introduce my colleague, Corneel Vandelnotte, who leads the Physical Activity Research Group and the 10,000 Steps program at Central Queensland University. His research has a real population-based approach to understanding health behaviour change, and he's published over 300 peer-reviewed articles, so lots of great insights into this area, and is also acknowledged as a top researcher in the field of public health. He's also the Vice President of Asia Pacific Society for Physical Activity, so we work closely together in leading the activities of ASPA, but also is the Editor-in-Chief for the Journal of Physical Activity, Sedentary Behaviour and Sleep Behaviours. And Corneel is going to talk today about how does 10,000 Steps intend to respond to the new guidelines, and you can see his title. I am going to now hand the microphone over to you, Corneel. Thank you.
Thanks, David. You didn't have to read all of that. Thanks also to Peter McHugh and Kristen Clark from the Advocacy Committee for organising this webinar, and thanks for inviting me. So just before we get going, I'd just like to point out that I represented ASPA on the consensus panel in relation to the development of the new guidelines, but other than that, I wasn't involved with the development itself. And so what I'm going to present is sort of a bit of my take on what challenges and opportunities are for messaging about the new guidelines. So it's not related to government, not related to the people that developed it, really. It's just sort of my take. And so I hope my slides are coming through. Okay, here we go. So in terms of challenges, communicating change is always hard. So consistency rules. If the message is always the same forever, that's what people eventually get. But then guidelines just have, by their very nature, as evidence continues to develop, the guidelines keep changing. And so communicating this change is difficult, and people often tend to get confused, and which is why we need really clear messaging. And so in addition to that, I think a real challenge with these new guidelines is that the new guidelines are actually quite complex. So there's 8 main messages. If you just look at the guidelines for adults, there's 8 main messages, and then there's 8 companion statements. So there's a lot of things to be communicated here. And so I can imagine many of you here are representing your own audience in some sort of capacity from your own organization, and you may be thinking, oh, how do we best communicate that much complexity? And so here are just some quick tips. I can't really go into too much depth about this. So obviously, if you want to reach large audiences and this is sort of population level stuff, then it may well be needed to simplify without changing the meaning of what's being said. Obviously, using plain language. Because there's so many different messages, you may well choose or pick some winners in relation to how they best relate to your personal audience. Tell it to your audience. Use visual tools such as infographics or videos. That helps. Always good to include a call to action so that when people become aware of the guidelines, they also do something with it. In this age of misinformation and disinformation, the use of trusted channels would be very important. And also, if possible, use credible spokespeople and champions. And I'll mention this a bit down in the presentation as well. I would recommend using the physical activity messaging framework if you are going to be communicating about these new guidelines. Just yesterday, I discovered the Federal Health Department put a brochure about the new guidelines on their website. This is the front page of it, and this is the page with that contains the actual guidelines. As you see, this is just on one page, but there's a lot there. They've combined the guidelines for the different populations as well. They clearly made the choice not to include the companion statements because that probably was going to be overwhelming. Personally, I don't think this is visually very attractive, but I think the main audience for this would be health professionals and not so much the broader population. I did come across pretty quickly after the guidelines were initially released. I saw this on Facebook, published by Outdoors Queensland. I quite liked it. It's very simple, not sort of saying this is the way that we should be communicating about the guidelines, but this is probably generated by AI, I think. I'm not sure, but the main messages do jump out in this sort of infographic style presentation. And then, as I said, I wanted to briefly touch onto the physical activity messaging framework. Just putting this paper up here. This is published in the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity. It's an open access journal, so this is accessible to anyone. If you are planning to do more communication about the guidelines, I recommend having a look at this. So this is the actual framework. It's a very, very busy slide, and I don't have time to even go into it. But just to say, communication is a terribly complex thing, and there's so many things that you need to keep in mind when you do it. And so I really recommend having a look at all the things that you need to think about if you are going to have a go at it. And so this is my take on the opportunity that the new guidelines create. So that's first talking about challenges and now opportunities. It's a bit of a long-winded introduction, but bear with me. So the first physical activity guidelines were published in the 1970s, and they were all about high intensity and vigorous physical activity that was needed to improve fitness, because at the time the researchers thought that only improvements in fitness would lead to improvements in health. And then in the 90s, that sort of shifted to also include moderate intensity physical activity. So a bit more public health focused guideline, still including 10-minute bouts of activity every time you're being active. And then in the 2010s, or at least near the end of the 2010s, there was ever more recognition of light intensity physical activity. And with the WHO also creating this new slogan, "Every move counts." And then now, with the 24-hour movement guidelines, in my opinion, that's gone even further. So obviously, Canada and Australia are frontrunners in this space. And there's a first explicit mention of duration in terms of light intensity physical activity, several hours. And there's also the first explicit step guidance for those who are able and track daily steps, aim for 7,000 steps or more. So for me, this is further elevation of the importance of light intensity physical activity for health, and it's gone a long way throughout the decades in terms of recommendations. And for me, there's a great public health opportunity in this, because I still meet many people that think of becoming more active is doing exercise, and exercise is hard work, it's high intensity. And I think if we are going to be communicating about these new guidelines, I think it'd be important that any activity at any intensity, whenever you do it, is going to help you. And I think that's a really important message to amplify. And then now talking a bit more about the case of 10,000 steps. I'm leading the 10,000 steps program here at Central Queensland University. And so now that the 7,000 step is sort of an official guideline, so what does that mean for step-based programs like the 10,000 steps program? So let's go one step back. Where does 7,000 steps come from? So the team that developed the new guidelines, they did a massive systematic review and meta-analysis to look at all the evidence in terms of dose-response relations between taking steps or walking and their health. And they published this last year. And then obviously the first thing the media did was jump all over this and go debunking the 10,000 steps myth and similar sort of headlines. And obviously that sort of doesn't sound very good if you have a program that's called the 10,000 steps program. But what does the paper actually say? So indeed, like most of the health benefits are achieved by 7,000 steps a day. 7,000 steps may be a more realistic target compared to 10,000 steps, but 10,000 steps is still a viable target for those who are more active. So it's not to say, forget about 10,000 steps. It's not. So even a modest step count was associated with lower risk. For example, 4,000 steps a day reduced mortality with 36% compared to 2,000 steps. So that's really not a lot of activity when you think about it. And the message, every step counts, should be emphasized. So what does this mean for a program like 10,000 steps? Well, for us, it's really business as usual. Nothing much has really changed. And we've known for quite a while that less than 10,000 steps result in many health benefits. Those studies have been out for a while. It's just that only now there's been enough to be combined into a meta-analysis and then make recommendations from that. So the program name has always been sort of aspirational and motivational. And in fact, when Professor Wendy Brown who conceptualized the program, when she first submitted the grant application for this, it was actually called the 7,000 step program. And then when they got the funding, there was some marketing people involved and said, well, let's change it to something, they didn't really think the 7,000 steps program was going to fly. And so let's make it a bit more aspirational and motivational. And that's what they did. And in my opinion, I think that's been a good move because, 25 years on, the program still exists. It's funded through the Queensland government by Health and Wellbeing Queensland. So I think it's been a great move. So what happens when people sign up for the program? The first step is always to assess your step baseline for over a week or so. And for some people, depending on what sort of job they have, maybe these baseline levels are actually quite high, 7,000 or 8,000 steps. And for some others, maybe because they have an office job, they can be quite low, between 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 steps. And the next step is not per se to go and reach 10,000 steps. Is to make a sustainable increase, and with the emphasis on sustainable. So in my opinion, success is a permanent increase of 2,000 or 3,000 steps on baseline numbers. And with permanent, we're not talking about a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but years and years to come. That is like something you don't have to think about anymore. It's just part of your lifestyle now. It takes about 10 minutes to do 1,000 steps. And so if you increase your activity level by 3,000 steps, that's about 30 minutes a day, which perfectly aligns with the physical activity guideline. And so reaching 10,000 steps is nice, but it's not realistic for many. And our program's byline since day one has been every step counts. So in a way, I don't know, Wendy Brown must have seen the future coming. She's a bit of a visionary, maybe. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Just plugging the program. It's a free program for anyone to use. Free for individuals across Australia and free for organizations and workplaces in Queensland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corneel. And you probably didn't see this as you were presenting, but in the chat, Kristen has kindly provided the links to the various documents that you were talking about. So that came through on the questions as well. Will these be provided? Yes, they have been in the chat. So looking at now shifting to a Q&A, general Q&A. Both presenters can participate if required. We're getting some coming through on the Q&A. The first one is strong recommendation re breaking up sedentary time. This might be for you, Monique. As often as possible was labelled as low evidence. Should this be more reserved? As often as possible is ambiguous and strongly worded considering low evidence.
Yeah, so in terms of like the strength of the recommendations and the certainty of the evidence behind the recommendations, these are separate things, but inherently guided by one another. So the strength of the recommendation based on, the harms versus the benefits and consider the whole picture. So yeah, as a team and with the methodologist that led this, we believe that it was, that the benefits outweighed the negatives, and it was a strong recommendation. And perhaps David can talk to that a little bit more as an expert in sedentary behaviour.
I think it's a well-balanced recommendation. I think that there's further research to do to get more prescriptive on that. And it's consistent with other guidelines as well. Yep. Next one is for you, Corneel. I think it's from Christian Brackenridge. Rather than business as usual, is there an obligation now for the 10,000 Steps program to advocate for behaviour change in sleep and sedentary behaviour, which probably already does?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We're certainly advocating for all the right things, and we've published some blog posts on the new guidelines that also talk about sedentary behavior and sleep on the website. Whether it will translate as to will we also develop new functionality on our web and app platform to cater for that, the tracking of sedentary behavior and the tracking of sleep. That's an entirely different question. It's really one with funding implications. You need to afford to be able to develop that sort of functionality. But it's certainly a very interesting question and something to have a closer look at in the future.
Okay. This might be for either of you, Monique and Corneel. How do you correlate step count with the latest physical activity guideline or the changes to the physical activity guideline?
I'll give you let's go. I think I sort of talked a bit about it in my presentation. 1,000 steps is about 10 minutes of activity. It's 100 steps per minute. So that's how you can sort of, I mean, there's with 10,000 steps or any sort of step tracking, there's a lot of incidental physical activity happening. Like just by the virtue of being alive, you will be tracking steps. So when I say if the 10,000 steps program can increase someone's steps by 2,000 or 3,000, that's not incidental. That's sort of purpose-driven physical activity. And I think that's sort of where it overlaps with the guideline the best. So not the incidental stuff that you do by virtue of being alive anyway, but sort of the extra stuff that you will do. And then 1 minute is about 100 steps, if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay. This might be for you, Monique, this question. Will the 24-hour movement guidelines be evaluated to determine whether they are more effective than earlier guideline formats at increasing physical activity levels?
I'll have to consult the dissemination team and get back to you on that one. It's not something that's easy to do. I know that it has been talked about, but.
Okay, well, this is another one for you. Is the 24-hour guideline also applicable to people in some special jobs? And the example is shift workers.
Yes.
Did the working group talk about these types of occupations or sectors?
Yes, it definitely came up, and unfortunately the evidence base often excludes shift workers from a lot of controlled trials and things. But in talking to consumers and things, it was still applicable to shift workers. Yep, considering the whole 24-hour day, the balance of the behaviors rather than, the time that you do things.
So there are probably some extra challenges for shift workers to be able to, because basically their schedule or their life gets thrown around all of the time because they're often not sleeping at night. So I mean, from a sort of physiological point of view, I'm sure that the guidelines apply. They're just human. But from a practical point of view, there may be extra barriers for them to actually live up to the guidelines, I suppose.
Yeah, the good thing is that, we are aiming for them to be flexible. It doesn't have to happen this way every single day. So being able to move around the behaviors depending on the day. One of the feedback from some of the work so far is providing examples on how people can meet these guidelines. And I know Canada's done some work on that as well. So for example, if you have a sedentary job versus, different types of jobs and things like that. So yeah, I've noted down shift workers, and so we can look into that more.
Okay. The last question I have in the chat or Q&A is, can you elaborate more on what the research found with respect to sleep and its health implications? Monique?
So I'm not a sleep expert, so the sleep team led these evidence updates. So in my understanding of it, and Corneel probably remembers from the meeting, not enough sleep and too much sleep were bad for the health outcomes. And so the 7 to 8 hours or 7 to 9 hours fell in the threshold for the optimum amount based on the health outcomes that were evaluated.
Yep. A last question came in, Corneel, for you. Can you please elaborate on the new guidelines recommending any activity at any intensity is good for you? How is this quantified, and how would this be communicated to the public? Should it be the view to building up to more activity over time? Question mark.
Yes, good question. I think, I mean, maybe I was a bit flippant with how I came out, but if basically more and more research is showing that light intensity physical activity is good for you, and already a whole lot of evidence exists around moderate and vigorous intensity, then it goes by saying like any intensity is going to be good for you. I mean, in terms of, it's possible to overdo it, I suppose, especially with the vigorous intensity, but then we're probably talking athlete level types of exercise. It's possible to overtrain. But I don't think when we're talking about population-based changes and all of that's really applicable. And as far as I know, there's not any sort of specific type of physical activity that's better or worse than others. Like any activity, whether it's walking, cycling, swimming, it doesn't really matter in terms of the health benefit, as far as I understand. So any type, any intensity, it's probably going to be good for you. And there was a second part of the question, but it's disappeared, so don't recall it.
Sorry, Corneel, that was me. How it will be communicated to the public. Should it be the view to building up more activity over time?
Yeah, good one. I think that's already in the guidelines at the moment, isn't it, Monique? Like build gradually, and I think Monique, that you're doing more work on exactly how all of that will be communicated. So wait and see, I suppose.
Okay. And I know there are additional questions coming in, but I wanted to remind everybody that we'll be sending a link of the recording in the next week, and we'll aim to send responses to the various questions that did come in and didn't get answered live where possible. The other thing to remind everybody is that we do endeavour to hold a second seminar after the promotional materials have been developed, which Monique alluded to earlier. We, of course, would welcome any ideas from those that are participating today on what they would like to hear in that webinar, and help to unpack what it is that we would like to take away from the next webinar on that, and the implementation challenges and opportunities that are likely to exist. We're getting close to wrapping up, but I just wanted to spend some time, if I may, and I'll ask Courtney if we could share some slides just to highlight activities that ASPA is undertaking. But before I do, I would like to thank both Monique and Corneel for presenting today, and for your time and enthusiasm in enjoying joining this. While we wait for those slides, I also wanted to extend my thanks to the Advocacy Committee, who have put all of this webinar together. Peter McEwen and Kristen Clark, thank you so much for all your hard work. And of course, to Courtney West from the Communications Committee, has really driven all the promotional materials related to this webinar. And I just wanted to highlight that we have had or introduced a new guest membership option within ASPA, which allows people who are interested in physical activity to stay connected with the society, but who may not be able to commit to a financial membership. And you can see the QR code there for the various membership options. Of course, those that are in a position to be contribute financially, they get additional benefits, but we really want to enhance the scope of the society as much as possible, and you can use the QR code that is on there. And I think that this just about wraps up my. Is there one more, Courtney? Is that our last one? Look, finally, just a flag here is that this is a new society, and we are undergoing minor changes to our constitution and bylaws update. This is just a flag to say that we will be holding a all-member meeting in later in or middle of the year to identify what these changes to the Constitution are, and seek approval from our members to proceed further with those constitutional change. We do have to provide at least 28 days for people to provide their comments, and so we might look to incorporating this meeting in our next webinar around the consumer materials. So we've reached a point where we'll draw our webinar to a conclusion. Again, thanks to everybody that's contributed to putting this webinar together, and thank you again to our presenters, and thank you everybody for participating throughout the webinar.